On this episode of Common Mystics, we delve into the mysterious death of an elderly Puritan woman in 1673 and the subsequent trial that would stun a New England community and set a dangerous precedent for future trials. I'm Jennifer James.
I'm Jill Stanley.
We're psychics.
We're sisters.
We are Common Mystics. We find extraordinary stories in ordinary places, and today's story takes us to Portsmouth, Rhode Island.
Jennifer.
Yes.
It was the morning of November 20th, 2023.
It was.
You and I were leaving our Providence Hotel, and we were headed to Portsmouth when we made our intention. Can you please remind our gentle listeners what our intention always is?
Of course. Our intention is to ask the spirits to lead us to a verifiable story that's previously unknown to us, but allows us to give voice to the voiceless spirits.
That's right. And some of the hits we were getting in the car, we were talking specifically about Anne Hutchinson, who we spoke a little bit about in the last episode.
Yeah.
But Anne Hutchinson is a distant relative of my husband, who is like the 16th great-grandson of Anne Hutchinson.
Well, how do you like that?
Yeah. So we were talking about generational trauma and generational conflict.
Right. In the car as we were driving to Portsmouth.
Exactly. So it felt to me like this was a familiar story we were picking up on, like a story about family or families.
Mm-hmm. And I was certainly picking up on a very strong Puritan vibe in the sense that we were going to have a story related to Puritans.
That's right. And again, I was talking to you about intergenerational trauma, going through family lines, and how that manifests after generations.
Yeah, that was a uplifting talk.
It was fun. It was a fun time.
And then we made a wrong turn.
We did.
And we ended up on the west side of Providence, Rhode Island.
Yeah, we were. It seems like we were being pulled to the west part of this peninsula over and over and over again. So
if I remember correctly, this was kind of a questionable area in terms of safety. Do I remember correctly?
I believe you're right. I believe you're right. This is before we got to Portsmouth. But again, it was like Spirit was like, no, you're too far east. No, you're too far east. So we'll see that again and again where Spirit's really trying to direct us. And like, I can almost feel like our guides being like, these assholes, because we were doing our thing. We wanted to go in a specific direction. Yeah. And they kept pulling us to a different direction. So it's just kind of funny.
That's what happens.
I was picking up on a strong female lead.
Like lead singer? What do you mean lead?
Like lead character. Like think like Meryl Streep. Think Jessica Lange. Like a strong female lead in our story.
Like Barbara Streisand?
Yes, like Babs.
All right, just wondering. And for some reason, fish seemed really important to me. Like cooking fish and going to market for fish. Like fish as a food and as a commodity kept coming up for me. So I finally wrote it down. Mm-hmm. And the smell of fish.
We then finally got to Portsmouth, and we were walking around that Portsmouth cemetery that we talked about earlier in our last episode. So we were both walking around separately. And what's funny is that you and I both circled back and took like a mass amount of pictures of this line of headstones, and the family surname was Borden.
Yeah, I had Borden headstones in my photographs, and so did you. So that was weird.
So, and then we talked about in the last episode, like you had that encounter where you were talking to someone that was not me.
Yes.
And then I was feeling we have to go to Newport. So we left. So I was like, look, there's still more to come on this story. And you said to me,
yes, there's the farmhouse.
Didn't know what that meant.
I didn't know what it meant either.
We just know stuff. It doesn't make sense to us. So tell me a little bit about Portsmouth, Rhode Island.
And I'm just going to stop because I'm so impressed that you have not called it Portsmouth yet. It's so cute. Every time I hear you say that, you pause for a minute.
It's true. It's really messing with my dyslexia.
I know it is. So good job.
It's really messing with me. So if I call it the mouth,
It's not. It's not the mouth. It looks like a mouth. It looks like Portsmouth.
It spells like mouth.
Yes, I know, Jill. That's how English works sometimes. But
English sucks.
This is Portsmouth. Let me tell you a little bit about the place, Portsmouth, Rhode Island. It was established in 1638 by Anne Hutchinson, whom we talked about in our last story, as well as her followers. It was a part of the original colonies that signed the Compact of Loyalty and established a new government on the Aquidneck Island, which was purchased from the Narragansett people. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, Portsmouth developed as an agrarian society, with the soil and farming conditions being favorable for various types of agriculture.
So because, Jennifer, you were feeling that puritanical time and vibe, I started doing digging and looking for our story and the voiceless along the time of like the 17th century.
Right. So like the 1600s.
Right. So tell me what we found.
Well, we found a story set in the winter of 1673 in Portsmouth that seems very aligned with so many of our hits that day.
Okay. Before we get into the story, tell me what it would be like to be living in 1673 Portsmouth. You know it was cold. It's the winter.
Right.
Like, how many levels of suckiness are we at?
Well, of course, life would have been very, very hard. Living in Portsmouth, Rhode Island during the winter of 1673 would have presented a life significantly shaped by the natural environment as well as the limited technology of the time. And residents would have relied heavily on the preparation done during the winter months, such as preserving food and securing supplies necessary to withstand those harsh, cold months.
Yeah, so they were in the summer, they were preparing, and then, they were harvesting and then like pickling stuff, for sure. I get it.
And their homes were constructed from wood and insulated with thatched roofs and mud. That sounds like a fire hazard.
Yeah, it does.
And those homes would require constant attention to keep warm, likely through a central hearth used for both cooking and heating.
It's just thinking about this makes me feel cold. Like, I'm chilled just thinking about this.
The community would have been close-knit, and they would have depended on each other for survival and assistance in these times of scarcity or in times of emergency. And extended family would often be close by or might live together. And during those winter months, daily life would slow down considerably, and the majority of one's day would be spent indoors, obviously, focusing on crafts such as candle making, weaving, woodwork, and maintaining tools that were essential for survival. Now, despite the harshness of the season, the resilient spirit of those living in Portsmouth in 1673 would see them through to another spring.
Well, not everyone, Jennifer. Not everyone gets to go to spring.
Uh-oh.
Tell me what happens.
Well, something does happen. On a cold winter's day, February 8th, 1673, Rebecca Cornell, a 73-year-old widow, retreated to her bedchamber. Living in a home with steeped roofs, a central chimney, and charming windows, it was surrounded by the farmlands once nurtured by her late husband, Thomas Cornell Sr. And also living in that home was Thomas Cornell Jr., her son, and his family, including his children and his second wife, Sarah. Also living there was a boarder named Henry Straight. Now, as her family convened for supper on the night of February 8th, 1673, the scent of mackerel filled the air of the house.
What's mackerel?
Mackerel is a fish.
Ooh.
It was a smell so potent that Rebecca felt nauseated and confined herself to her bedroom.
She just really didn't like the smell of the fish. She said it made her dry. I don't know what that means. I don't know.
Like dry heave?
Oh, maybe. Maybe. That's probably it.
Yeah. I mean, fish Fish can have a really strong smell, and when cooked indoors, I can see that.
I just don't be the asshole who brings fish to your like work cafeteria and reheats it.
Oh, that's
You know what I
the
mean?
worst.
Don't do that. Don't
That's
eat
the
fish
worst.
on a plane. Be respectful.
Don't bring your tuna sandwich to your
Exactly.
seat in 4G. Okay, thank you. Duly noted. Worried about how she was doing, Thomas Cornell Jr., her son, after enjoying the mackerel dinner with the rest of his family, visited his mother in her bedroom. Rebecca and her son Thomas chatted for almost an hour. And later that night, Sarah, Thomas's wife, sent one of her stepsons upstairs to see how she was getting on.
So Sarah sent Thomas's son Edward twice up. The first time he knocked on his grandma's door and he was like, "Hey, are you doing? How are you feeling?" And she was like, "I'm fine." He's like, "Do you want any warm milk?" And of course she was like, "Ew, gross. No, thank you." And he was like, "Okay." And then the next time he knocked on the door, there was no answer. So he was like, "Something's not right here."
That's right. This time, the second time he checked on her, there was no response. So Edward cracked open the door to his grandmother's chamber to uncover a truly ghastly sight. Rebecca was on fire.
What?
Grandma was burning.
Oh my God. I would have lost my shit. I would have been like a chicken with its head cut off, being like, "Ah, ah."
Well, he was alarmed as well, and he called for the others in the household, and Henry Strait, the boarder, was the first one to get there to respond, and Henry managed to extinguish the flames.
Oh my God.
Thomas arrived with a candle and was confronted by the grim scene. His mother was dead, burned alive. The following day, as snow blanketed the ground, the coroner arrived at the Cornell residence. A 12-man inquest panel was quickly assembled to delve into the circumstances surrounding Rebecca's tragic death. After examining her scorched clothing and gathering testimonies, the panel sadly determined that Rebecca Cornell's death was an unfortunate accident. However, within a few short days, that cause of death would be changed to murder.
Okay. Why was the cause of death changed? There was a 12-man panel. They did a thorough investigation and they considered Rebecca's death an unhappy accident. This was not a situation like Benjamin Burton where the coroner was just like, This was like they talked to people, they looked at the physical evidence, and they were like, yeah, this was just a very unhappy accident.
Well, there was new testimony that emerged after that official inquest.
What? Who? Huh?
The source of that new testimony was Rebecca's brother, John Briggs. Now, John Briggs reported to the authorities that on the night of February 12th, just 4 days after Rebecca's untimely death, John Briggs was visited by her restless spirit, claiming its presence in the dark.
What? So he was going around telling people in puritanical New England that Rebecca's ghost visited him in the night and people believed him. They weren't like shocked.
Yep. According to Baylor University and other online sources, ghosts were kind of a big deal in Puritan beliefs, and they were taken very seriously in 1673 Portsmouth.
Yeah, as it turns out, the Puritans believed that ghosts proved the existence of God and like the Holy Spirit. So although there was like a dispute about like why would ghosts show up, like what are they doing here? Why are they messing with me? They're all like, but they're real, because if you don't believe in them, then how can you say you believe in God or the Holy Ghost? So it was like a thing.
I mean, I think that's solid logic personally.
I mean, among other things that the Puritans believe, I think this is one of the most solid arguments I heard from them, but they're not really, you know what I mean? That's a very low bar.
That's true. So, right, that's one of the reasons that John Briggs' story would have been taken seriously by authorities. Also, Briggs was a well-respected active member of the community. He served on the town council. He was a magistrate in town. He was also a deputy to the Rhode Island General Assembly. The dude was part of the social and political elite. He was a credible man with good reputation.
Okay, so what exactly happened? Like, how did they respond to this?
Okay, now this information comes to us directly out of a book entitled Killed Strangely, The Death of Rebecca Cornell by Elaine Foreman. Now, it was February 20th when John Briggs shared his remarkable story to the authorities of the vision that he described as not easily dismissed. He said that he lay in his bed between sleeping and awake. And in that state, he felt something heave up the bedclothes twice and thought that someone was coming to bed with him. He then awakened and turned over in bed, and he perceived a light in the room likened to the dawning of the day, and saw the shape and appearance of a woman standing by his bedside. Frightened, he cried out in the name of God, "What art thou?" The apparition answered, "I am your sister Cornell, and I said I was burned with fire." And then the ghost repeated, "Look how I am burnt." Through the dim light, John said that he had seen Rebecca's features as severely burnt from the shoulders, face, and head.
I'm throwing down the bullshit card on this.
Why do you say that?
I don't understand. Well, I mean, he lives in this town. His sister, like in the same town as his sister died.
Yeah.
And I'm sure he knew the manner of her death. So why would she make it a point to come to him in the night to be like, "Look, I'm burned"? He's like, "Yeah, I know. We buried you like 8 days ago."
Yeah, he definitely would have known how she died for sure.
Yeah, like, "Hi, ghost that states the obvious. Anything else?"
The Puritans and other Christian groups at the time held a belief, Jill, that a restless ghost would return to seek revenge for their murder. And this was the essence of John's tale regarding the nocturnal appearance of his sister's spirit. See, presumably, the only reason Rebecca's ghost would show up was to seek vengeance. Like in the Puritan mind, there'd be no other reason for her to show up.
Well, she literally didn't say that. She was just like, I'm burnt.
Right. The retelling of what Rebecca's ghost whispered to her brother was left intentionally ambiguous by John Briggs. Now, there's a reason for this, and that's because during the 17th century in Rhode Island, laws strongly discouraged individuals from levying accusations without solid evidence. Furthermore, committing perjury to secure someone's conviction and subsequent execution through the death penalty was considered a capital offense. So, John was protecting himself by not directly accusing a murderer in his story.
Okay, again, I'm feeling like this, my sister's ghost came to me, is really suspicious, and I just don't understand why he would open up that kind of can of worms. And who did they believe, or who did it come out was believed to have killed her?
Well, there was a likely suspect.
Wait, what? Why?
And you're not going to believe it.
What?
The suspect was her son, Thomas Jr.
The one living with her?
Yep.
The one that was talking to her?
Yep.
To make sure she was okay that night?
Yes. Let me give you some family history. Thomas Cornell Sr. and his wife Rebecca Briggs Cornell were from Essex County, England, and forged a respectable reputation there. They lived near the market town of Saffron Walden. Now, Thomas Cornell Sr., despite never receiving formal education and being unable to read or write, held the respectable position of a constable in the English town. His family's ancestry was noble, tracing back to King John, indicating a legacy of distinction. Now, before their departure for New England, Thomas and his wife Rebecca managed a lively household with 8 children.
That's a lot.
That is a lot. At 45, Thomas, alongside 38-year-old Rebecca, embarked on a bold expedition to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, bringing their substantial family along with them. Among their children was Thomas Jr., the third child and eldest son, born around 1627. At the age of 11, Thomas Jr. journeyed with his parents, 4 sisters, and 3 brothers to the New England colony, marking the start of a new era for the Cornell family.
It sounds exciting, but it sounds also like a pain in the ass to have to like pick up everything, sail the ocean, build a house, especially at 11. Oof.
Incidentally, the family's arrival to the Massachusetts Bay Colony coincided with the Antinomian controversy.
What is that?
Good question, Jill. I just had to look it up myself. The Antinomian controversy kicked off in the 1630s, and it was a huge theological and political drama. And at the heart of it,
Tell me the details.
And at the heart of it was our girl, Anne Hutchinson. She was a bold Puritan woman who wasn't afraid to challenge the big shots in the colony. And she had some pretty out there ideas for the time, like thinking people could get personal messages from God, and that doing good deeds wasn't what got you into heaven.
Ooh.
Now, her views really shook things up, making her a threat to the whole Puritan belief system. And that was all about being chosen by God and the church's role in salvation. The whole colony got swept up in this controversy, with Anne and her followers, who were called Antinomians, on one side and the Puritan leaders on the other. And things finally came to a head in 1637 when Anne was put on trial and then kicked out of the colony for heresy. The fallout from the Antinomian controversy left a mark on the Massachusetts Bay Colony, ramping up the tension between those who dared to think differently and the Puritan powers that be.
I can see that. And what else are you going to do in the 1600s Massachusetts Bay Colony? It's either going to church or arguing about church or doing other churchy things or like farming. That's all you're doing.
After Anne got kicked out of the colony for heresy, she went on to establish Portsmouth, Rhode Island. And do you know what else?
Tell me.
Rebecca's brother, John Briggs, at the age of 29, was one of the earliest and maybe even the youngest of the Portsmouth sandlers, rumored to have followed Anne Hutchinson.
Oh, wow. So does that mean when Thomas Sr. and Rebecca got to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they followed suit and they went to like look for Anne and John Briggs, the brother?
Well, not right away. Thomas Sr. and his family were staunch supporters of the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so upon arrival, Thomas quickly acquired a house and 112 acres from an individual who happened to leave the colony with the Antinomians.
Oh, okay. So he's like, are you guys going to use this?
Right.
Can I have this?
Right, exactly. It sounds like he was kind of an opportunist, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
He went to the places where people were leaving behind farms and property and shit.
And there was like a brewery or there was like an inn. He was like, can I take that?
Yeah, he did.
You done with it? Yeah.
Right. And he secured a license to operate that inn that was left abandoned. Now, Thomas Sr. ventured into coastal trading as well, dealing in beer, cider, and rum. However, he was known to occasionally indulge in his own merchandise.
I would. I mean, it's cold, especially during those winters. Just warm me up inside. Some rum.
What's that phrase that they tell drug dealers? Like, don't get high off your stash.
You are the
supply?
cutest thing ever. Yeah, you don't use your own supply.
Well, I mean that's applicable here.
It's true.
I
mean,
what?
It's like this is different. You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
This is rum.
So you shouldn't be doing that. He and 4 others were fined by Connecticut authorities for excessive drunkenness.
It was a good night.
Oops. Who hasn't been there?
Oops, I did it again. Seems like he was doing well. He found a bunch of drinking buddies. He had friends around town. He had an inn going.
Yeah, you'd think so, but there were changes ahead.
Oh, God. I don't like change.
Thomas got into more trouble, this time for selling wine without a license and charging too much for beer.
Thomas Sr., what are you doing?
When Thomas Sr. tried to explain himself, he said it was because making beer in the winter cost you a lot more since you need fire to keep the brew from spoiling.
I mean,
That sounds legit.
What had happened was
He even said sorry and played the "well, I didn't know the law" card, mentioning he wasn't used to running a place like this. It was all a big mistake. So the authorities dropped the fine but wouldn't let him renew his license. And they told him that he had a month to sell off his stock. And after that, no more running his entertainment spot. To make matters worse, Thomas Sr. didn't do himself any favors by sharing some unpopular religious views, which pretty much made him and Rebecca outcasts at the church.
So what happened is that they were like, you did something wrong. And he's like, you know what? Since we're talking about who's doing something wrong, I have some things that I want to say to you about the things that you're doing because I think you're wrong.
And another thing. So all of this drama made Thomas Sr. want to pack up and leave the colony by 1640, just 3 years later. And the family decided it was best to follow John Briggs to Portsmouth. So they all went the way of Rhode Island, where Anne Hutchinson was.
Well, that's cool. He met up with Anne. She was a big deal at the time.
She totally was. The Cornell family was welcomed into Portsmouth society immediately. And within a year's time, they were granted land for cattle, and Thomas Sr. was made constable of Portsmouth. He eventually designed specific earmarks to distinguish his cattle from those of other neighbors.
Yeah, so he branded his own cattle.
Oh.
That's a big deal.
Is it?
Like that you have, if you have so many cattle that are wandering around, you got to keep track of them.
So many cows.
You're like, that's my cattle. Get your hands off my cow.
Okay. Right. So at first, things were going great. Thomas Sr. hooked up with the rest of Anne's crew and everyone was happy and making friends. But things were about to change again.
Jesus.
After the death of her husband, William, in 1642, Anne Hutchinson, alongside several families, decided to move once again.
Where'd they go? Why'd they go?
Yeah, moving sucks.
I know. Can you imagine moving?
No.
In the 1600s?
No.
Oh, my God. It sucks today.
Well, they were facing pressure from Massachusetts ministers who wished to force her to abandon her beliefs and submit to the idea that Massachusetts would soon control Rhode Island.
Can you guys just back up? I don't understand. Massachusetts, calm down. You're really full of yourself right now. It's a little much. Slow your roll. Let's pop that ego bubble of yours.
Yeah, they're flexing again for sure.
Oh my God.
So Anne Hutchinson moves again, and she seeks freedom from Massachusetts interference. To find peace and escape their reach, she and her children relocated to the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. What we know.
Which is New York.
New York, yes. Setting up their home on the shores of Long Island Sound. That sounds like some good real estate.
Yeah. Yeah, it does.
And Thomas Sr. and his family followed Anne to New Amsterdam.
Okay, but then how did they end up back in Portsmouth?
Well, the Cornell and Briggs families decided to leave New Amsterdam following the tragic attack on Anne Hutchinson's family by Sewanee warriors.
That would do it. If we got Sewanee warriors attacking people, I'm going too.
15 people, including Anne, were axed to death.
That's not good.
And their bodies burned.
That's not good.
And then after the massacre, fear, unrest, and the desire for safer lands prompted many to return to Rhode Island.
Yeah, because you have to make a choice. Do you want to sit here and may get attacked by some serious-ass warriors? Or do you want to be like, oh, we're going back and Massachusetts, you stay out. This is Rhode Island.
Yeah, I think I'd rather face Puritan ministers than indigenous tribal warriors, for sure. Now, back in Portsmouth, Thomas Sr. finally hits his stride, becoming a big landowner, a juror, and even earning a spot on the town council. Plus, he was on all kinds of official committees. Now and then, he'd bump into his old buddies, like his brother-in-law, John Briggs. And the folks in town trusted him enough to pick him as their town rate maker.
Which is like a tax
collector,
collector.
Somewhere between the 1640s and early 1650s, he got involved in another land venture, this time over the border in Plymouth Colony, in a place that would end up being called Dartmouth. And then tragedy struck again.
Jesus, this guy needed to write a book. There's so much happening in his life. What happened?
Well, it ends. Thomas Sr. passed away in 1656 at the age of 61.
There's just never enough time, you know?
Now, according to the 17th century documents, in his will, Thomas bequeathed everything to his wife, Rebecca, and appointed her as the executor of his estate. However, this raises questions about his eldest son, Thomas Jr., and it's a little puzzling as to why Thomas Sr. chose not to allocate any portion of his real estate to his adult son, leaving historians to speculate as to why he did that.
Especially because I thought it was like law in England that women couldn't own anything. So it's just weird in New England colonies, still under English law, that would happen, but whatevs.
I mean, I don't know historical English law well enough to comment on that, but it was remarkable that there's no evidence to suggest that Thomas Sr. ever transferred property to his children by will or otherwise, a practice which, by the standards of the 17th century, is considered somewhat unusual by our sources.
Maybe Senior just trusted Rebecca enough to divvy up the land. Like he was like, you take care of it, Ma. I was tired. I trust you. So, do we know if she left the land to anybody? If the land was divvied up between her 8 children? What do we know? What do we got?
Well, Rebecca didn't just leave a will. Rebecca herself had a will, and she was splitting up her land while she was still alive, actually, giving parts of the property to her adult children. Everyone got a share except her oldest son, Thomas Jr.
That is so messed up. There would be such a fight in my family. I would be like, oh my God, I would blow it up. I would be like,
Yeah,
talk to me why.
It doesn't seem fair. In her will, Rebecca left the house that she was living in with Thomas and his family to him when she passed away. But there was a catch. With inheriting the house, he'd have to give his siblings $100 each when he officially took over the home and the farm in Portsmouth. And that was like giving each of his 7 siblings about $8,000 today.
Okay, so to recap, Rebecca inherits everything, and she has 8 children. She's still alive, and she's giving gifts of land and money to 7 of her 8 children, except for Thomas Jr., who is the oldest. She's like, you can get the house only when I die. And when you do, you're going to have to give $8,000 to each of your 7 siblings because they need some of that money too. Not to mention that they're already living on the lands that I already gave them. That's really messed up.
It is. She really had some sort of beef with her oldest son. But get this. She told a friend that she wouldn't have left Thomas Jr. the house and farm either if it hadn't been for his first wife, Elizabeth. Apparently, Rebecca really loved her son's first wife because she had left her some pricey linens in her will. Now, Elizabeth was the only daughter-in-law to get a mention in the document. And Elizabeth's early passing must have shaken up the relationship between Thomas Jr. and his mother. And it was pretty obvious to everyone who knew the family that Rebecca and Sarah, Thomas's second wife, were not close. So if she loved his first wife, Elizabeth, she hated his second wife, Sarah. In fact, they barely tolerated each other.
Yeah, they didn't even, like, to save face, like, put on an act like they were cool. They were like, no, I just don't like her.
They were living in the same house.
Ooh. So they were living in the same house, but were they living with Rebecca because Rebecca needed help around the house because she was aging? I mean, she's 73 in 1673. That's old. That's old back then.
Okay, we don't know the exact details of the arrangement. Now, we can presume that helping to maintain the house and the property and generally help out Rebecca might have been part of the deal when they moved in. But I should also note that Thomas Jr. and his wife Sarah and their family were living as boarders in Rebecca's house. In other words,
which means they were paying rent.
Exactly. They were paying rent. They were leasing out the first floor of the residence. And Rebecca also had another boarder who was unrelated to her, Henry Strait, renting space in the home. So basically, she's treating her son and his family the same as she would any stranger who she's renting to.
Oh my gosh. So okay, but why was he boarding with her? Like, you would assume living close enough in the town, he would have been able to like come over and help her if she needed. But why was he actually boarding in that house?
Well, for a number of reasons, Thomas Jr. and his family were struggling financially, and they did need to live with his mother for financial reasons.
Okay, so you would think, I'm not a mother, but if Bug, my son, my beagle, came to me and was having trouble financially, under those circumstances, even if he just would not stop eating poop, which he does, I would want to help him. I would be like, son, let me help you. You don't have to pay me rent. Just as long as you take care of me and the farm and try to keep the poop eating to a minimal, I will help you.
Thank you for that analogy.
Hang in there, guys. We'll be right back.
Hi, everyone. We are so excited to unveil the first book in our series entitled Common Mystics Present Ghost on the Road Volume 1, Murders and Mysterious Deaths.
It's everything you love about common mystics and more.
It's a retelling of 10 of our favorite stories from our pod with exciting extras.
Extras like souvenirs, what we took away from the experience, and what to know if you go if you decide to travel in our footsteps.
Pre-order the Kindle edition now. All other formats of the book will be available for purchase at Amazon.com on July 1st, 2023.
Thanks, guys. Now back to the show.
It is pretty common to think that most parents would want to make life easier for their kids. But guess what? Back then, when it came to who gets what from the family treasure chest, it often boils down to how well behaved and disciplined the kids were.
Oh my God.
Earning that inheritance often comes with a catch. You've got to stay in line or risk being cut off.
Wow. Okay, so that's probably why Thomas Sr. left everything to Rebecca. So that he was like, you're going to still be alive. You can tell who deserves these things.
Right. And parents would want to keep a tight grip on their assets while they're alive, both to look out for themselves and to make sure that their children don't start thinking they can just run the show without their input.
That begs the question, why was Thomas Jr. treated so harshly and, in my opinion, unfairly by his parents, especially his mother?
We don't know exactly why Thomas Sr. and Rebecca weren't thrilled with Tom Jr., but we can take a few guesses as to why.
Okay, what do we know?
Well, we know that Thomas Jr. was a soldier involved in a massacre that killed many indigenous people. And I'm a little confused by this because I thought, like, from the Puritan/colonist's mind, at least in the mind of American colonists in the 1670s, like, that would be a good thing. Like, if you massacred the indigenous people, like, I thought that they were giving people medals for that shit.
So this is also a time when the Quakers are coming and acclimating to the area, and places that weren't so under the puritanical Massachusetts Bay hardcore control were being influenced by some of the Quakers.
Okay.
And
Quakers aren't into murder and killing and war.
No,
Got
they're
you.
into oats.
Okay.
They're into oats. They're into granola. Buckles. They're big on buckles.
Okay. Buckles, oats, granola, check. Murder, not on the list.
No.
Okay.
Nope.
Okay. Also, Tom Jr. had a history of legal problems.
Well, now who doesn't?
Thomas Jr. was a defendant in criminal proceedings in New Netherlands and was charged with theft in 2 separate cases. So,
I mean, his dad was charged with drunkenness and
charging too much for beer.
yeah, so
Yeah,
I don't know why they're looking at Junior like,
I mean, it appears that they were throwing stones at glass houses. But being the oldest son and the namesake, they probably expected a lot more from Thomas Jr., and it's pretty clear he did not meet their expectations.
So I bet that's why Uncle John Briggs could tell that there was bad blood in the family. He probably knew all the tea on Tom, and that's why he came up with the ghost story, because he was probably suspicious because they knew that there was bad blood, and he was like, you know what? Maybe we should look at Tom Jr. He was the last person to see her. Let me conjure this ghost up and tell everyone about the story to have them look at the situation. Got it. That's what I think. What do you think?
I mean, everybody knew that Rebecca and her family were at odds. Like, she was very vocal about not liking Sarah and not liking her son, and would like talk to anybody about that who would listen. And I can see why the community would take a closer look at Thomas Jr. as the prime suspect because of that. He had access to his mother, and he was the last person seen with Rebecca alive, and he had a motive because he would inherit the home and farm, what was left of it, after her death.
Okay, so he's arrested for his mother's murder.
Yes.
What happens with the trial? Because there's a trial, right?
Right. And as you can imagine, it is a highly publicized case. And
what else are you going to do? What
Right.
else are you going to do?
And we can also note here that this was one of the earliest recorded cases in which a spectral or ghostly evidence was allowed in a trial.
And of course, that was provided by Uncle John Briggs.
Correct. So here's how it went down. The hearing started at the General Court in Newport on May 12th, 1673.
Thomas, he was like, I'm not guilty. I didn't do this. This is ridiculous.
Right. And then witness after witness got up to the stand and told stories about the bad blood between him and his mom.
Oh, God, that sucks.
Then the prosecutors turned their attention to the physical evidence.
Okay, tell me what the physical evidence suggests, because to me, doesn't seem consistent, but go on.
Well, we're using physical evidence very loosely here because we're really depending on witness accounts of what that physical evidence was.
Good point. There wasn't really forensics back then.
Right.
Thank you.
And the witness accounts paint a very vivid picture.
Tell.
A servant from the Cornell household reported seeing Rebecca on the floor, surrounded by flames from her lower body up to her armpits. From her lower body up to her armpits, with only her shoes recognizable amidst the blaze. Another observer said that fire damage near the hearth, along with scorched walls and a trail of burns marking the floor, was present. And the prosecution made the case that Thomas Jr. deliberately ignited the fire that engulfed his mother and then cunningly stayed close enough to extinguish any flames that threatened to destroy the house and property he stood to inherit upon her death.
Wow. Can you, like, what happened? Did they believe that story? Because that does not seem like a likely scenario in my mind.
The jury quickly reached a unanimous decision, Jill,
Innocent.
delivering a guilty verdict. And Thomas faced a grim fate, sentenced to the noose. This chilling episode marked potentially the first recorded instance of capital punishment in the state of Rhode Island.
It's a big deal.
Thomas met his end on the gallows in Newport, Rhode Island, a somber event that echoed through the community. Despite pleas from neighbors and friends, Thomas's final resting place was not beside his parents in the family plot, which added another layer of tragedy to his story.
Especially Thomas specifically was like, okay, if you're going to kill me, I just want to be buried next to my parents.
Oh.
I don't want to be buried alone. And they're like, nope.
That's so sad.
It is. So tell me what happens after his death. What's the aftermath of this shit show?
Even after Thomas's tragic end, the saga was far from over, Jill.
Why? What happened?
His wife, Sarah, and the indigenous servant from the household found themselves ensnared by accusations, charged as accomplices to the heinous crime. Yet, in a turn of events that captivated all, both were acquitted, thank goodness, leaving whispers and shadows in their wake.
This leaves me with a lot of questions. Why would a community leader or community leaders continue to seek out murderers or accomplices in Rebecca's death. They killed Thomas. He's been executed. It should have been put to rest. Does this, it shows to me that there was a lack of confidence in what they did. They weren't sure if they were right in their conviction and killing of Thomas Jr.
Right. Well, we have to get into the 17th century Puritan mind to understand this. See, they believed that misfortunes were a result of divine punishment for the undeserving. And so now, picture the baffling case of Rebecca's tragic death, now believed to be the result of foul play. Rebecca wasn't just anybody. She was a pillar of the community, a woman who dedicated her life to God. And the question that haunted all of her neighbors was, why would God allow such a fate to befall such a pious woman? And the only two conclusions could be, one, that God allowed a pious woman to be murdered in a horrible way, or two, God allowed Rebecca to die in a horrendous accident, and the community murdered an innocent man. So it seems the community was almost obsessed with Rebecca's death, and they could not let it go. And they continued to look for answers even after the end of the trial.
Wow.
The trial that ensued, by the way, might have seemed fair by the standards of the 1670s, but even contemporaries at the time recognized that it leaned a little too heavily on shaky circumstantial evidence, even verging on contradiction at times. For instance, John Briggs, do you remember his account of Rebecca's ghostly vision that came to him?
I do remember this.
And what did he say about her face and head?
He said that she was burnt from her shoulders on up.
Yep. But the evidence was that she was burned from her armpits down. Then there's Thomas, her own son, accused of orchestrating her demise to claim his inheritance, his method of which risking the very home that he aimed to own. His actions cast a long shadow of doubt, pushing the Puritans to question their own judgments.
Wow.
So driven by fear of divine retribution and a desire for the truth, the community's relentless pursuit of justice for Rebecca wasn't just about solving a murder. It was a desperate effort to ensure that they hadn't condemned an innocent man and to clear their conscience in the eyes of their unforgiving God.
This, it must be so exhausting being a Puritan. Oh my God.
I would not know.
It's Jesus.
The splinters alone.
Oh my God.
At the time of Thomas's trial, Sarah, his wife, was pregnant.
I didn't know that.
She gave birth to Thomas's 7th child after his execution, and she named her daughter Innocent.
Well, that seems like a very thinly veiled reference to her thoughts regarding her husband's conviction.
For sure. I love that quiet rebellion. You go, Sarah.
What is the significance of Rebecca's death and Thomas's trial? This seems like a big deal.
I was hoping you were going to ask that because the legacy is ridiculous.
Tell me everything.
Jill?
This really is a big deal. We can't stress enough what a big deal this is. He's the first person in Rhode Island to get executed, and it set legal precedence. So what does that mean?
Well, as previously noted, this case was the first to permit spectral evidence in the courtroom. In other words, ghostly evidence, spiritual evidence, and served as a prelude to the adjudication methods of the infamous witch trials that would come some 20 years later, and of course resulting in many more questionable deaths due to questionable evidence.
Wow.
Yeah, girl. Yeah.
So Uncle John Briggs is really no different than those teenage girls accusing Rebecca Nurse.
Oh my God, that is hysterical.
It's true. It's crazy to think about, but yeah, it's true.
Wow. I don't think he was hysterical though. The girls, they're hysterical.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was calmly I don't know, she showed up, wanted to get in bed with me, and then told me some shit.
Which, again,
I know.
Puritan, like,
That's
like, come
unsavory.
on, you guys. Come on. So, yeah, gross on so many different levels. And by the way, if a woman, I wonder what the response of the community would have been if a woman said that their sister showed up in spirit.
For
You know what I
sure.
mean?
Oh, yeah.
That would have been like, you're a witch.
Yeah.
Why are you conjuring up your sister's spirit, right? But
Well,
because,
that's a great point.
yeah, it's annoying. I cannot with the Puritans, just saying.
Well, the whole thing was super hush-hush.
Tell me.
Even at the time.
Oh, it was?
Uh-huh. According to Elaine Foreman in her book, Killed Strangely, The Death of Rebecca Cornell, we know that the leadership of Portsmouth tried to create and maintain a wall of silence around the trial of Thomas Cornell Jr.
So they were very, very shamed by this. Like, you don't hide something that you're not ashamed of.
Right. Well, we can presume that it was because they knew that the results of the trial were questionable. They were based on circumstantial evidence, and they led to the execution of a man who maintained his innocence until the end. And as a result, the incident was not well documented in the canon of New England's records.
Suspicious.
An example is Ezra Cornell, the co-founder of Cornell University and third great-grandson to Thomas Jr., included nothing about these events in his detailed genealogy. The official records only mention that Thomas Cornell died in Portsmouth in 1673. Other descendants of Thomas Cornell Jr., such as the Reverend John Cornell, labeled the trial as, quote, utterly absurd. Justice Thomas Durfee, a member of the Rhode Island Supreme Court, analyzed the case from a legal standpoint.
And this was in about the 1800s when he was looking at this case.
And he determined that, considering the testimony, it's impossible to declare the verdict completely unjustified. However, feeling fully confident in the verdict is almost equally challenging. So basically, he's like, yeah, you can't believe that it was true, but you can't believe that it wasn't true.
Yeah, but I would say from my perspective, not only at the time they were very hush mouth about what happened, but also for generations they didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to look at it and be like, no, that was probably justified.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, the Supreme Court Justice of Rhode Island, like that was 200 years later. He was looking at this case, so he was probably like, yeah,
but he didn't come down either way.
I know.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Which is bullshit because obvious to me, like this, he did not kill his mom. But that's just my thought.
It's telling that 200 years after this event, Supreme Court Justice in Rhode Island Supreme Court is still agonizing over this event and trying to make sense of it.
Yeah, especially because I think it was one of the first capital punishment cases in Rhode Island. Yeah, interesting.
So who do you think the voiceless is, Jill?
Oh my gosh, Jennifer. It's Thomas Jr. 100%.
Why do you think?
Let me count the ways. First of all, his parents really treated him badly. He was singled out by his parents not to inherit anything. And while his mom was alive, she was divvying up land to the kids. And she was like, no, you're going to have to wait till I die to get something of this property, while he was the one living there taking care of her. Yeah. His mother was talking mad shit about him all the time, him and his wife. And while he was living in the house taking care of her, and she was like, you need to pay for rent as you're in my house working my land. You need to pay rent.
For sure.
And then he was I strongly believe he was wrongfully accused of his mother's death, not due to any concrete evidence, but because his uncle, his bored-ass uncle, was sitting there 12 days later being like, my sister appeared to me, tried to get in bed with me, and was like, oh, wait, I'm burnt. What? I don't know.
Right.
What do you think?
I mean, I agree with you. I don't think Thomas murdered his mother. They're living in a wooden house with a thatched roof, and they have a hearth, right? Probably several. They have several fires probably going in the house. It was winter. She was probably feeding the fire, and I think she just got an ember like in her clothes and thought that she could put it out by herself, and it got out of control and she didn't call for help. That's what I think. And actually, as we've been talking about this, the image that keeps coming to my mind is our grandmother's house that burned down back in 1987, I think. Anyway,
85.
it was February when Grandma's house burned down, the same way it was February when Rebecca died. And our grandmother had she had a 4-flat, and one of the elderly women who was renting from Grandma had a candle and was trying to find her hair comb that she dropped. And she accidentally lit her bedding on fire as she was holding this candle, trying to get her brush or her comb from underneath. And she didn't call for help right away because she thought she could just put it out by herself. And that's why she didn't call for help right when it first, set on fire. And then it ended up taking the entire house down. But that's how I feel about Rebecca. I feel like Rebecca was trying to take care of the fire by herself. She was an older woman. She set herself on fire accidentally and was trying to put it out herself, but she went up too fast. Her clothing just started to burn, and thank God that Edward checked on her, because she never called for help.
Mm-hmm. Some of the theories about how she could have accidentally got burnt or got emblazed was, one, she was sick that day. She wasn't feeling well. She was probably cozying up towards the fire. You know what I mean? Like getting close.
She was getting too close.
And then she was a smoker. She smoked a pipe.
Oh.
So she could have fell asleep while smoking
holding
the
a
pipe.
pipe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So those were some of the alternatives to murder.
Well, I agree with you that Thomas was not responsible for his mother's death. Besides, if you say he wanted to kill his mother, say he wanted to, that's the worst possible way.
So many easier ways to do it, especially because she's 73.
And they're feeding her. Yeah.
Yeah.
So our hits, when we talk about a familiar story in the sense that it has to do with a family, why do you think that that's relevant?
A couple reasons. Anne Hutchinson, my husband's family are descendants from Anne Hutchinson.
Right.
Also, we found out that the Cornell family is descended from King John. Our paternal line is descendants from King John. So just saying.
So we are cousins to the Cornells.
We're DNA cousins to the Cornells.
DNA cousins.
So when we're talking about a familiar or families involved,
Yeah.
that was true on many different levels.
Wow. And by the way, when we were in the car talking about your husband and his connection to Anne Hutchinson, we had no idea. We had a story in front of us surrounding Anne Hutchinson.
Exactly.
Right.
We were just talking about Anne Hutchinson. And what we were specifically talking about Anne Hutchinson is, wouldn't it be weird if Chad inherited or was reincarnated from some of those figures in Anne Hutchinson's life, right? So we were talking about that inheritance of that trauma and dealing with the result of Anne Hutchinson's life and how she was dead and ostracized. How do you say it? Ostracized?
Ostracized, yeah.
Thank you.
Of course, there is a strong Puritan connection to this story.
Yep. You're not lying.
And the strong female, who do you think that was?
I think it was Rebecca.
I think it was Rebecca too,
was?
for sure. I love that I picked up on the fish, because that was the reason that she didn't eat dinner. And I can also see Sarah being so pissed. Like, Sarah's taking care of the household. Sarah has cooked dinner, and her mother-in-law is like, I don't want that shit, and goes upstairs. So the fish is significant, because that's why she was by herself in her bedroom when she died.
Not only that, but if she would have ate dinner with the family, Edward wouldn't have kept coming up to see if she needed anything.
Right.
So they all could have died if not for the fish dinner.
So talk to me about Portsmouth, because we take a wrong turn. We end up in Portsmouth Cemetery, and we both take pictures of Borden family graves. How is that a connection to this story, Jill?
There's so much going on here. I just have to break it down. First of all, as you noted, in the car, we were being pulled west, but we are we're not we're going to Portsmouth. We're not going to the west coast of this peninsula island. We're not doing that. But when we're walking around in the cemetery, we were getting impressions about a story inside of Newport. So we had to leave. But before we left, we were taking pictures of the Borden family name, right?
Right.
So,
and we didn't know. We did not know that both of us were both drawn to the Borden name.
Correct. So we get in the car, we go, we get our Benjamin Burton story, and then we leave. When we leave Portsmouth to go to Newport, I say to you, there's more on our story to come. And you said,
yeah, there's the farmhouse.
So we go to Newport, we do our Jennifer and Jill classic mess around, and then we head back in the car. When we leave Newport is when we pass the original farmhouse, the land.
Okay.
After we went to Newport and we left, we drove past the original site of the Cornell house. While the original house did burn down in 1889, the house was rebuilt 6 years later using the plans of the original farmhouse. The reconstruction is still standing and now operates as a Valley Inn restaurant. So we drove past that.
Oh my
gosh. Yes, indeed, there was more of our story to come, and it did involve the farmhouse. But I got more for you.
Okay.
You asked me about the Bordens?
Yeah, because that seems significant.
Well, Jennifer, do you recall a one Lizzie Borden?
Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her father 40 whacks.
And when she saw what she had done?
Gave her mother 41?
Right.
That Lizzie Borden.
That Lizzie Borden.
Okay, what about her?
Thomas Jr. and Sarah's daughter, Innocent, was the daughter who married into the Borden family.
Oh.
And it was her great-great-granddaughter, or Thomas's Jr.'s fourth great-granddaughter, who was accused and acquitted of murdering her father and stepmother.
Wait a minute. Lizzie Borden, the Lizzie Borden, is a direct granddaughter of our Thomas Jr.?
Yep. Through Innocent.
Wow.
Through Innocent.
Oh, wow. So why do you think we're talking about this?
Oh, my gosh. There's a couple weird things happening right now around this story. As we mentioned, we were here on November 20th, 2023.
Yep.
But just this April, and as we sit here today, this is Annie's birthday. It's 4/28. So this past April, there has been a popular podcast series tackling the events surrounding Rebecca's death and the trial of Thomas Cornell Jr. that started as a 6-week series in the beginning of April. So with that, there's been a lot of modern media looking at this case. And every time you click on something, you see only that there's a connection to Lizzie Borden. And people say, Lizzie Borden, she wasn't the first one in her family to kill her parents. Look at Thomas Cornell Jr., her fourth great-grandfather. So Thomas is like, whoa. I didn't kill my mom, dude. Leave me alone. Take my name out your mouth. I'm just like, let me be dead. Stop hooking me up with this crime. I did not do it. We're not talking about Lizzie. I'm just saying I didn't do it. So to create more interest around the case, they use Lizzie Borden's sensational story to get people to look at Thomas's case in that vein.
Right.
And not being like one of the first original men that were killed in Rhode Island probably was innocent, or that the testimony was the first of its kind that opened the door to the Salem witch trials 20 years later. None of that. They're not looking at this case in the right historical context. What do you think?
Wow. Well, I think you summed it up great, Jill.
Does it make you mad?
It makes me feel sad for Thomas, and I can see why he is unhappy with the connection between himself and his situation and Lizzie Borden. And it's so ironic because he was found guilty of a crime that he did not commit, we believe. And here's Lizzie, who is acquitted for a crime that we believe she did commit.
Can we talk about Lizzie on Detours?
Oh my gosh, let's do it. But in the meantime, please tell our people where to find us.
Sure. Please check out our website, commonmystics.net. Follow us on all the socials at Common Mystics Pod.
Please subscribe, download, like, and share.
please consider leaving us a positive review. We love reading them and sharing them on our socials. And don't forget to share, share, share.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night. Bye.
This has been a Common Mystics Media production. Editing done by Yokai Audio, Kalamazoo, Michigan.